Well, so good morning to everybody. Thank you very much for being here today, again, second day of the International Conference on Bilingual Education. I have the great pleasure to introduce Lid King. Lid King is a graduate in modern languages from the University of Cambridge. He has extensive experience of language teaching at all levels and in all phases. He's a specialist in language learning pedagogy. He was an advisor, materials developer, and chief examiner before becoming director of the Center for Information and on Language Teaching and Research, CILT, in 1992. I have to say that when I went to London, appointed as education counselor at the Spanish Embassy, I met CILT a few days after my arrival, and since that moment we are, I think, good friends. I have to say that Lid helped us in our work. He supported all the embassies trying to do their job, that is, promoting their languages. My job in the UK was to promote Spanish. Other embassies had to promote their own languages, and Lid, as director of CILT, was very supportive at all times with us, and we worked together, I think, very well, and it was a very pleasant period. In 2003, he left CILT because he was appointed as what they called at that time the champion of languages, which is the director of the National Languages Strategy, I think. Yeah. So in September 2003, he took up the post of National Director of Languages within the Department of Education and Skills at that time, and with responsibility for the effective implementation of the national languages strategies and its centerpiece of introducing an entitlement to language learning for all pupils in Key Stage 2 by 2009-2010. He coordinated the national implementation strategy for primary languages between 2003 and 2010. His role has also involved working with key partners to promote language learning and giving strategic advice to ministers on languages. Between 2006 and 2007, Lid worked with Lord Daring on the Languages Review, of which he is co-author. This updated the national strategy and set out a range of initiatives aimed at reforming languages education in England. Between October 2008 and March 2010, he continued his work as National Director for Languages on behalf of the DCSF, which was the name of the Department for Education, but within the languages company created for that purpose. Dr. King also works at European level. He has coordinated 2 European projects since 2008, LinguaNet Worldwide and Languages in Europe. He is currently a member of the Comité Stratégique sur les Langues, advising the French Education Ministry. I have to say that Lid and I, we talk in French. We have always talked in French, and we still do. He is also honorary fellow of the Chartered Institute of Linguists and officier dans l'Ordre des Palmes académiques. So I think it's a very good CV, and I welcome Lid, and I give him the floor.
Merci. Thank you, Xavier. I've come with an interesting CV, perhaps, but today I've come from a different country. It's called political country, and I hope I'll come as a friendly native speaker to Clill land to try and tell you a few things about what we think in political country about Clill land, or maybe give you some insights. Of course, in one way, it's a very simple matter. I've had a fantastic day listening to all of your ideas and plans, and the vibrancy and the enthusiasm, you can touch it here, even when you think things aren't so wonderful, and that's important to know as well. But what is the big deal? What is the idea? It's really a very simple one. 30 years ago, one of my predecessors at SILT, talking about what we then called intensive language learning, said this: the most significant feature of intensive language learning is the use of the language for some other purpose than merely learning it. That's it, simple. Question is, how do we do it? We found a simple, during the recent period, we produced with Doe and another colleague, Bernadette Holmes, some guidelines on CLIL in England towards an integrated curriculum. And at the beginning of that, we said, you know, what's the big deal? There's nothing new about linking language with meaning. That's what we do when we learn to speak. We learn to speak for purpose, to communicate meaning. And that helps us to access the world, and the language we use also shapes our understanding of the world. And there is a tradition in language learning, foreign language learning, if you like, of that same accessing meaning. In fact, it just reminded myself, reading a little article in here, written by a very young woman called Doe Coyle, because this book is a little bit old now, in partnership with another very learned man, about this question. And he started off by saying, well, of course, this all began with the ancient Romans, who used to use Greek slaves to communicate with their children about real things, and then they would learn language. So what we are doing now, seen from that perspective, is a simple thing. However, and perhaps we should regard it as something normal. And when I looked around in preparing for this, because it's not the centre of my expertise, I discovered that bilingual experiences are happening across Asia, across Africa, using language to do something else than to learn language. Perhaps, though, by the way, if you were interested, we're revising this at the moment because all of the political framework from political land is out of date, so it needs to be changed. But it will make it better. You can still see it either by going to that website or by sending me an email if you're interested, because I didn't bring lots of copies with me, but you might be interested. Xavier was talking about the English situation and how many good things have happened over recent years, but also things have started to change as well. And that's a first indication, if you like, or perhaps a little lesson, that politics can affect pedagogy because things can change. And there might be some lessons for you in that. Let me just tell you very briefly a brief history of CLIL in England. It'll be very brief. I'm not going to go back to the ancient Greeks, but we could have gone back to the learning of Latin in the Tudor grammar school, for example, which was done in a very CLIL kind of way. But more recently, and things that I know about, in the 1980s, there were a lot of attempts to combine subjects, and there was even joint certification. I remember going to see some of Spanish business studies and so on. So people were doing that in schools. Then Doe Coyle pops up around that period of time. There was some development of support and networks, training ideas, a lot of it going on at Nottingham University, where Doe was then. We had embassy support, which Javier mentioned yesterday, and the development of some showcase schools. SILT, where I was working, got some money to do a little project. Doe was involved in it again, working with schools to try and come up with some ideas about how to do this thing. We called it CLIP. It was Content and Language Integrated Project. We liked CLIP, the idea of CLIP. 2007 was actually quite important because the language review that Xavier mentioned gave an opening for really rethinking our languages curriculum, in which content became a very central element of it, for some very concrete political reasons, I have to say, we found that lots of our pupils were being turned away from language because they found it boring and they found it difficult. And this was seen as a way of actually changing that situation, which is what the politicians wanted to happen. So politics impinged on that very well, and that developed. That was the stimulus for the guidelines that I just mentioned. And so that was going very well until we had an election. And in 2011 we had an election and everything stopped. So just a little, now I'm not saying the same will happen with your election, I'm sure it won't, but it can happen. Now it doesn't stop, it changes, new things come, we have to rethink. And that's why the political aspect of this, I think, is very important. Okay, that's something about England. I just wanted to say that the context in which I'm talking to you about this is something that Doe mentioned yesterday. The massive change in how learning takes place. I mean, the analogies with the ancient Greeks are very interesting, and maybe the essence of things stays the same, but we have moved from that's Erasmus, I think, image of learning, a wise man maybe talking to 2 or 3 wise or not so wise, probably boys, to this cartoon, which is learning in the 21st century. I don't know if you can see that. Can you? C'est le cours d'anglais, je ne sais pas, j'entends rien. This is learning. I can't, for those who don't know French, is this the English lesson? I don't know, I can't hear anything. There are so many people. Mass education. How do we transpose our ideas about education into this massive desire and need for everybody to be educated to the highest possible level? That's one of our big challenges, which I guess you are part of resolving or attempting to solve or attempting to take forward. I just thought of something. This is a CLIL lesson, isn't it? So I should start off by doing some scaffolding. And I forgot to do the scaffolding. So here's the scaffolding. This is what we're going to do. I'm going to talk about what policy is. I'm going to ask the question, what is bilingual education? I'll come up with our working hypothesis on that fairly shortly, talk a little bit about bilingual education in Europe, but lead up to what the key, as I see it, policy-related challenges is, the word from policy land. Okay, some preliminary issues, though, about policy. Now, again, I refer to some of the work that we did. You might want to, this, if anybody's interested, I can give you contact of it. It's a book about where we think Europe is going in policy terms in relation to languages. And one of the things we talk about in that is how policy actually happens, as opposed to the way that people like us think that it happens. You probably think that policy happens logically, through doing some planning, doing a bit of research, coming up with a plan, seeing whether you can cost it, and off you go. Well, some of it's like that, but actually reality is mediated in different ways, and we explain this in greater detail there. I just want to leave you some thoughts in relation to this. The one element is the vision. You all have a vision, I think, and it's very important to have a vision. What do you think? Why is this such a great thing that you're trying to do? What are your objectives in relation to children and children's understanding of the world? Because that probably is one of the visions you have and the things that drive you most of all. But there's also the actual decisions, the laws and the regulations, the laws about the curriculum, what can you teach, what can't you teach, whatever it might be. And then there's a third lot of things which are very interesting, which is actually performance, what we actually do. And there is very often a dislocation between any of those three. For example, in many countries in Europe, the statement about which languages are taught is not the same as which languages are actually learnt. There's usually a much larger range of languages which could be taught than are actually taught. And so the policy is the combination of all of those things. If you're interested in those issues, please read the book, because I think it is fascinating to find out, particularly coming with somebody who didn't originate in policy land and comes to see how these things happen and what happens, sometimes for individual prejudices by ministers. If I give you one little example, I don't want to get too anecdotal because there's not time. One of our very important policies was a new assessment system called the Languages Ladder, which I think was very good, and it fitted into making small steps, small advances in languages. There was a very good vision for having that and a very good pedagogical reason for doing it. One of the reasons that we were able to do it was the minister at the time, who is now the plenipotentiary foreign secretary for the European Union, liked the idea of her children getting swimming certificates which they could put on the wall in the bath. So she said, why isn't there something like that for languages? Oh yes, Minister, we just thought of that, here we are. So they can be decided because of prejudices by ministers. Sometimes good ones, sometimes not so good ones, but I won't mention those. So policy is not just what is written down, it's the way that people behave, and it is the customs and traditions that people have. Within that, there are also three key issues about policy, which have some relevance to our discussions this week, I think. The first one is the relationship between explicit and implicit policy. I kind of touched on that already. No, with the idea, what we think is that policy is decided in this logical way. And yeah, we want a new policy on languages. The objective is to increase the number of people studying Spanish. So we will put this we've researched it, we'll put this into place, we'll measure and see how well we've done, etc., etc. That sounds like real policy. Formal language policy making, if you like. In reality, actually only a minority of policies function in that way. But in general, that's what we think should be the ideal form. When we actually look to see what influences language education choices, the language behavior of individuals, social groups and nations, we see that that's much too limiting. We need to distinguish that kind of language policy from the operation of economic, social, political forces that impact on people's choices. And the role of English in the world today is a very good case in point. I don't think there is any country, or no, there is no country in Europe, there are countries outside Europe, which say that English is our main foreign language. But it is. And those are choices that people, individuals, are making. So understanding that between what is explicit and implicit is very important. There are other ways that implicit policy can impact. And here's a statement which I never know who said. I think it was Mao Zedong, but it might have been Milton Friedman. So it's either a very left-wing or a very right-wing person. There's no such thing as no policy. An absence of policy means a decision not to do something. That's the case in the UK, for example. We have a policy that you don't have to study a language after 14. So that's the decision is you don't have to, that's not an absence of policy, that's a policy. And similar examples you can find. So there is no such thing as no policy. That could work in another kind of way. Well, interestingly enough, there is no policy in the UK about what the official language is. We don't need one. There's no question about English. But some countries have it written into their constitution. So policy explicit is not the only thing. There's another key issue that we unearthed, which is the distinction and also the connection between language policy and policies about language. Now, what I mean by that, and it's something that somebody's already touched upon, and it's very relevant to the CLIL argument, I think, which is that if you look around, you'll find many, many statements of policy about language. Many countries have language policies. I found this on the web. Sorry for the rather dramatic. Oops, I missed one. No, I've made a mistake. It's hidden, I think, by mistake. So I'll have to find it for you later. But what it is, it's a list of different kinds of policies, language policies. It doesn't matter too much in detail. And you will find that there are policies about assimilation policies, non-intervention policies, bilingual policies, etc., etc., etc. And he categorizes language policy throughout the world. What's interesting about that is not to go into the detail of what all those policies mean. You know, for example, French has got an assimilation policy. French is a dominant language within the country, for example. But that very few of those policies include mother tongue, foreign language, community language, in a comprehensive policy. So we have a dislocation between what the policy is for Spanish, what the policy is for the teaching of English, sometimes even between the teaching of English and the teaching of other foreign languages and the teaching of immigrant languages, whereas we know there is a connection. And I think that's something that is very relevant to thinking about CLIL and how CLIL might develop. And the third issue is, despite ourselves, we who live in language land think that languages are so important. Politicians actually think it's pretty important, but there are other issues that they think are more important. There are big social, economic drivers, and our language policy, and I think this is probably the key point to try to understand and see what implications it has for us, is part of that, certainly viewed from politics land. So, for example, you talked yesterday, Javier, a lot about standards. Politicians throughout Europe are obsessed with standards, raising standards, and they want to know that what you're doing is raising standards. Now, you might think, well, there are other things that are more important, but that's what the politicians want to know. And how much and what by. And so those are issues you have to take into account, whether you like that idea or not, because it relates to issues of funding and finance. But they're not the only issues. The dramatic slide that I mistakenly found, these were what I identified from my experience in England, working with policymakers, as the main drivers which impacted on education and impacted, therefore, on language. That was one of them, raising education. The last government and the current government, totally obsessed, pushing standards up, measuring standards, getting standards higher. If we could prove that learning a foreign language, and I think we can, but we need to do that in polity terms, could raise your general cognitive level and convince the politicians of that, you would get funding for doing lots of things. Skills for employability and mobility has been another major, and we have a difficulty in England in that respect because people are not convinced that you need a language other than English for employability and mobility. You don't have that problem in Spain. I think everybody knows it to be the case, whether it is or not, that you need English. And parents know that, head teachers know that, and so on. Another policy driver, though, is the softer things, civilization and culture. Our present government are very keen on this. In fact, one of our ministers recently said, it's a mark of being an Englishman to be able to speak French. It's about the culture, about that joint culture. Globalization, competitiveness, cooperation. I think those are big issues, particularly post-2001 and with the financial crisis, the economic arguments for multilingualism, and very, very important arguments within the European Union, less effective within England. And lastly, and this is very important for us, but is probably downplayed in some areas, the whole argument about social cohesion and identity. Actually, I think this is one of the most critical arguments about language, which is sometimes ignored. We are living in these really complicated, complex, multilingual, multicultural societies where mobility becomes normal, intermarriage of all kinds becomes normal. The world is transformed since the days of, well, even my youth and my parents. My grandfather or father travelled only to fight wars. That was it, until the 1960s or 70s, when we came in a little car to Spain, and this was an amazing adventure. well, look now, my son's got a girlfriend in Mumbai, and they fly out to Mumbai to meet periodically. The world has changed enormously. Our cities are such different things. So the whole identity question, social cohesion question, becomes actually a matter of very, very vital policy, and we see the effects of not dealing with that in riots in Paris and in London and in other places, in my belief. And the question is, what has what you got to do has got to do with that? Because I think it does. Because I think you are raising, if you get things right, a generation which is open to difference as opposed to one which is closed and tending towards xenophobia. So some big policy issues which we need to think about in terms of what we do. Not every day, because you've got to get on with the teaching as well. But they are important issues. Already, we can see that, well, I just wanted to show you that. Here, for example, are some of the Council of Europe carried out some policy profiles of different countries in Europe. I was involved in one in Armenia, which was fascinating. And those are some of the issues that they raised as being broad issues that most countries where profiles took place were saying about language. And you'll see again there the quality standards and coherence issue coming in. There's our English lesson again. That's the challenge for you, the challenge for turning that mass into real individuals who can really relate to others in these complex societies and can be mobile and can be successful in the current economy. So if the politics are tricky, what about the terminology? That's the one I want to go on to now, because there's a... Oh, sorry, there is something... Excuse me a minute. Okay. Yeah. What about the terminology? Now, we're okay. I once spent a confused hour at a conference talking to somebody about bilingual education. And she was actually listening most of the time because she was a very forceful woman. And it was only well into the conversation that I understood what she meant. And what she meant was teaching in which everything was translated. It was sort of like Michel Thomas kind of approach. That was what she called bilingualism. So what is bilingualism? What do you understand by bilingualism? Now, I just checked up recently, and we can find bilingual programs in all of those places and more. And we can find all of these different types, as they describe them, of bilingual teaching. And we could add in CLIL, which we don't have there, or we could add in intensive. So that's, that was from my 21st century oracle called Google. That's what we found. So we've got all of those different kinds of bilingualism. And the key idea, if there is a common idea, is about learning through language, new content, but a lot, and I think Fred might have something to say about that tomorrow, a lot of the bilingualism that we talked about there is it, well, here's a question for you, is it different from what you're doing? Because a lot of it is about bilingual education for people whose first language is not the national language, bilingual education for immigrant populations and so on. And there is a very I don't apologize for spending some time, sorry, I keep on showing you that and then taking it away again. We'll get there in the end. I don't apologize for spending a little diversion to talk about that, because I think it does have some relevance, particularly in the way that the policy people have reacted to it. Particularly in the States, it's become a very controversial issue. This cartoon illustrates it. I don't know if you want to help out by reading the Spanish. No? Hola. Yeah, read the Spanish.
Hola.
Why don't you want to learn English?
Sí, quiero aprender inglés.
That's it. I'm declaring English as the official language.
Pero señor, sí quiero aprender inglés.
Ballots and store signs will all be in English.
Hijo, enséñame cómo se hace. Quiero aprender inglés.
Well, that reminds me, bilingual education should be ended.
I want to learn English.
No comprendo. So, now, it has become a controversial issue in the States. The idea behind that, bilingual programs, and I hesitate to say that in front of real experts, but there's a lot of evidence for this. This is the academic evidence, is that you access knowledge not by suppressing your first language, but by supporting your first language, and through that you become better at learning the new language, in this case English, or whatever it might be. And I think that's pretty, as far as I can read it, as much as anything's incontrovertible, it's incontrovertible. So why this? Why has it changed? Well, the policy change in the US is quite instructive. 1968. Bilingual Education Act. Congress mandated bilingual education in order to give immigrants access to education in their first language. Federal spending up to $150 million by 1979. 1974, there was a Supreme Court ruling which said that San Francisco schools were violating students' rights when they educate if they didn't give them special provisions. Then a debate. 2001, No Child Left Behind, which we imitated in the UK. We had a very similar thing, but that made no provision for bilingual education, but emphasized accountability in English only. And then there was another court case in 2009. The majority opinion stated, research on early language learning instruction, English language learning instruction, indicates there is documented academic support for the view that structured English immersion is more effective than bilingual education. Now, why are judges taking decisions about academic research? I think that's the point, that these are mainly political, not pedagogic decisions. So if you ignore politics, you are weakened. You need to understand. And now, what has been going on, I don't pretend to know. We have colleagues here who know far more about the US than I do, and I'm not holding up the US as an example, because a very similar thing has happened in Europe. And I'll say something about that in a minute. Perhaps not as dramatically, but there has been that same kind of tendency. Well, we end up is, there we are, the poor, sorry, bilingual education has been voted down, so we can't help you anymore, you'll probably fall behind. Oh well, and the poor little boy doesn't even know what she's talking about. It's sad. I say the same thing has happened in Europe. There has been a retrenchment in the last few years, which I have observed, which is showing a level of fear about supporting immigrant languages. And all of the countries in the Education Committee have pulled back from statements of giving support to minority languages, stressing only the importance of learning the national language. Well, nobody actually argues about learning the national. Of course, everybody will learn the national language. So I think there are some lessons there about how politics impinges on what is shown to be pedagogically the right thing to do, and how multilingualism is a hot potato politically in the current era. So that's something for us to think about. But you might say, well, we're actually talking about something different. I would just leave you that as a question. Are we talking about something different? Or are we missing something because that aspect of CLIL or bilingualism isn't integrated into what we do all the time? It's a question. So what are we centrally talking about at your conference? Well, here's what we said in our national guidelines, 2009, goes back to the simple definition. Language is used as a tool to develop new learning. But that, just to go back to my previous point, that's why I think we do conceptually need to bring the other bilingual experience into that, because that's precisely what that's doing. Complementary value, process and use language to acquire new knowledge and skills and make progress in both language and subject area content. And you're also familiar, because though she doesn't like talking about this too much, so I'm going to leave it. That's the 4 C's, which are a kind of description of the approach, but not a mantra or not something to be, that's what I think Do's concern is. That's what we're talking about, I think. So the other things I've mentioned have impact on that, but that's our central theme for today. So where is that going in Europe, and what are the messages from political land which might help us to understand better? Well, on one level, things look good. Despite what I've said about multilingualism more broadly, the European Commission is very committed to the idea of CLIL. They describe its benefits, there's some of them, but interculturality, improving competence, developing multilingual interests. I mean, I think you would want to be more radical than this. The second one's interesting, isn't it? It doesn't require more teaching hours. That's not what you were telling us yesterday. But that's what the European Union thinks. But so it's positive. They've got a website devoted to CLIL. The programs specifically support CLIL approaches. That's very much paralleled by work that's going on in the Council of Europe. Recent work on the languages of education or the languages of schooling. It seems to move from one to another. There was a conference last year in Geneva, which was very interesting in that respect, and where, for example, a publication was produced about the language needed for science. And those were the headings. I won't go into the detail, but it goes to quite detail level, not just about vocabulary, but about the linguistic and semiotic competencies needed for science education. That impinges very much on what you're doing, but it's coming from somewhere slightly different. I think it's something you might want to look into. Personally, I don't know what you think. I'm not sure. I'm not convinced about whether we have, in the context of language learning, language for science, language for history, language for geography, language for... I'm more interested perhaps in the very simple distinction between language for basic communication to academic language, which everybody needs to be able to acquire and access knowledge at a higher level, the Bix and Calp discussion, which I think somebody is talking about later, because I think actually, apart from the vocabulary, the language you need to operate in science is not different from the language you need to operate in history, if you're talking of presentation, the language acts that are important. However, that's a little bit of an aside, and let's leave it. So, all of that, though, from the European Union, from the Council of Europe, is very much at the level of ideas, the vision that I was talking about earlier. It's yet to be translated into legislation or regulation, but I think it probably does impact on what people actually do. The reality may be less developed than the vision, but it's moving very far and very fast. Of course, in Spain, I think you're at the head. You might not always feel like it, but you are, in terms of the scope of what is being attempted and the amount of thinking that is going into that process. But, I missed another one there. But it is happening, if you look at Eurydice, 2008, for example, CLIL is listed in there in this key data book, and every country in Europe, with the exceptions of Malta and Luxembourg, with the exceptions of Greece, Iceland and Liechtenstein, and Denmark, strangely enough, were doing some kind of CLIL work. The only countries, I got it the wrong way round, the only ones where all schools were involved in CLIL were Malta and Luxembourg. But CLIL is very common throughout Europe. And of course that's a formal position, you know more than I do, which moved on since then. even so, I'm still thinking about trying to grasp definition. I think that there are distinctions within Europe because there are a range of practices. Just one example, which could be an important distinction. I was in Prague for a conference on bilingual French schools a couple of years ago, and also I've done quite a bit of work on policy in Bulgaria. And in many Eastern European countries, there are bilingual schools which are quite clearly a very elitist kind of bilingual. I mean, I've got no problem with that in itself. They are, as somebody said, to turn Czech engineers into French engineers, or whatever it might be. And they're based on selection, and that is what they are for. That's a kind of bilingualism. Now, I say I've got no problem with it in the sense that I think we need very, very high level of bilingual competence, and that's for sure. But elite bilingualism is nothing new. We've had that for ages. The British ruling classes have been quite bilingual in German before the First World War, and since then in French. The Russians used to be bilingual in French, and so on. We are now, I think, engaged in something different. So understanding what the bilingualism is something I think quite important. I think you're probably thinking of something rather different as well. And that brings me really to what I wanted to say. I mean, not I wanted to say everything that I've said, but the key point of what I wanted to say. That CLIL, bilingualism, immersion, whatever you want to call it, is not just about good ideas. It's not just about pedagogy. It's got a policy and political significance. I think that in developing the work that you do, because you're at the forefront of this work, you need at least to understand that, to take account of political constraints and realities, not least financial ones, and also be clear about what you want and what you mean. Positively, as I've said, CLIL, bilingualism, is trendy, and at the European level at least, people say it's a good thing. But take heed from the US example, it could change. So what are the challenges as I see them? And you might think of others as well. Well, firstly, the questions of definition. Is it bilingualism for a few, or for many, or is it both of them? Is it bilingualism for monolinguals, or is it bilingualism which supports existing bilingualism, or is it both of those, and can they be made to work and support each other and help each other? This is the good thing now, I don't have to answer the questions. But second category of political type questions, what are the drivers? Now you'll know this better for Spain or for Madrid than I will. I talk about my own experience, but they are likely to include, I guess, standards and quality. And how does that impact what you have to do? And how can you answer that question? Again, I mentioned, Javier yesterday spoke a lot about that. And I think that there are some important discussions to be had then. Politicians want simple answers and they want things quickly. So if you say, well, this is going to be good, the next statement, and they're going to learn better, the next statement is, or the question is, when and how much? So that means that after 4 years, they will be at this level. Show me. And they want you to be able to do it. So you have to be able to also answer the question, yes, but not if I only have 1 hour a week and I haven't got any resources and I don't have any time to think about what I'm doing. It won't happen. So that's a dialogue. Competitiveness and employability, is that the driver? I think it is in many countries. English, in particular, is something that is being driven because of the view that you need English to be employable. When we were in Armenia, one of the phrases that we heard time and time again, every mother knows, it's always dangerous, isn't it, what every mother knows? Every mother knows that their children need a university education, technological skills, and English. That's it, that's Armenia. Abu Dhabi, rich little country, a comprehensive national education reform strategy, one of the recommendations issued recently at the Emirates Centre for Strategic Studies and Research. Among the concerns we had heard was how the United Arab Emirates could reform its current educational programs so that we are able to keep up with the global scientific and research community, and what are the skills we must import on our pupils so they compete with international peers. And an essential element of that was English. Or are the drivers social cohesion? How do we articulate that argument so that the policymakers will see that we are not talking about something soft but something vital in terms of the citizens that we are making for the future? Are there other drivers which drive policy in terms of education? It could be, actually, I heard one yesterday, was it Juan Fernando? Yeah? It could be, I mean, an example given there was the school wants to stop from closing. And that's a driver, or from declining, and so let's do something new, and let's build something. That's politics. See, you're a politician, you didn't know it. And what are the systems you have to cope with? We have a very heavy assessment regime in the UK, so the first question people ask about bilingual programs is, yes, but will it affect their geography? Will they make progress in the other subjects? And actually you have to answer that question, because we're not doing CLIL so that their languages gets good, it's for they're acquiring new learning. And what about teacher training? The big question for everybody, how are we going to cope with those issues of teacher training? And the curriculum, how is the curriculum set up? Very much an issue for particular countries because of particular frameworks and resources in general. And ideology. What are the ideologies that matter if you're thinking of developing and interfacing with politics? Well, one of them is to do with the national language. In Armenia, to quote that example again, it is law that you can only teach in Armenian. Now, they get round that. They teach in Russian, they teach in English, and they teach in French, but they shouldn't. So that can be an issue. The same point was highlighted in the Arab Emirate that I mentioned. One point was highlighted was the need to make sure that a dedicated bilingual curriculum was developed so that while pupils learn English, it is not at the expense of their mother tongue. And I think related to that is the general role of English, and is English going to become something different from other foreign languages? I leave them as questions because time is running out. And also educational beliefs. Our minister currently is obsessed with grammar. That will be a question that he wants to know, yes, when will they learn the pluperfect tense? He asked that question. Well, we could laugh at that answer, but it doesn't really help much laughing at ministers because they don't actually make the good decisions then. So what's your answer? Your minister might have the same view. And how does that relate to what you want to do? You have to think about it. So, to go to a sort of conclusion, I came here just to share some reflections, to ask you some questions really from politics land, might help you think more about this exciting approach to learning. I don't have answers. Well, I've got a few, I think, but I think you need to think of answers as well. I'm sure that you need to think about those questions because it's not just, or even perhaps mainly for the politicians. And I'm going to mention your talk again. I thought it was fascinating, just the realities of how you do things and how you make change happen. Because it happens at the level of a school and an autonomia and a region and a country as well. I hope I've at least given you an insight or lifted the curtain about how policy happens, what it can and can't do, and how they can help or hinder what you're trying to do. Because another point as well, which I think Xavier was trying to make, I'll just say it in an image, one can get carried away with things as well, and over-enthusiastic and over-promise. In that sense, it can be just as dangerous to jump onto a bandwagon as to stand in front of a bus. It comes with the same result. So, but as a kind of conclusion, I think we can be positive. We know that it works. The evaluations of what you're doing have been, in Spain, have been very positive. My experience is that head teachers, even in the UK, are very interested in this idea. And I'll leave you with a view, I called it a view from the south and north, because it was based on a review of the Australian policy, carried out by Joe LoBianco, but also informed by Richard Johnston from Scotland, who had reviewed some of your bilingual work here. And the conclusion that Joe LoBianco draws is that if we are really going to make any sense of language in the 21st century, language learning in the 21st century, there are two things that we need to do. One, build on the linguistic capital of immigrants, because we have a gold mine of language, which at the moment is not brought into the school. And the second, develop intensive or CLIL type approaches for the monolinguals or the other as well, because conventional language learning doesn't really work, despite all of the investment that has been put into it. And that was Richard's explanation of that, talking, referencing to Spain. He calls it breathtaking in its scope and its speed of implementation. So I think what we are doing, what you're doing, is something very exciting, very important for the development of Europe as well as Spain. Maybe what I've said can help you manage it better, not do it better, that's up to you. And I've got my last picture that I found on Google, which sort of represents what we're trying to do. Thank you very much.
Tenemos 5 minutos. Recuerdo que a continuación, a menos cuarto, hay 2 paneles simultáneos, mientras vienen las preguntas. Uno sobre medios de comunicación, donde estarán presentes los medios El País, El Mundo, Escuela y Magisterio. Y otro panel simultáneo en el Salón de Grados, donde estarán representantes de diversas embajadas presentes en España, Estados Unidos, Reino Unido, Irlanda, Francia, Italia y Portugal. Well, there are some questions. I ask you the first one, which says, as you're familiar with policies in many countries, do you see a rising interest in promoting bilingualism in other languages such as German, Spanish, or Chinese? Don't you think we should have a more open perspective in this respect?
I think that's very interesting, and I think Doe Coyle, for example, might know better than I do. My impression is that a lot of the bilingual work of the kind that you're mainly discussing here is with English, obviously not in England, but it's not entirely. There are some very good examples of German, I think, working with German. French is also. Some of that, as I said, is in the more elite spectrum, and I think it'll be quite interesting to see whether in Europe the differentiation between languages and how we manage that. Because some people, you mentioned the Comité Stratégique. Well, I'm not allowed to say what happens there, but you could imagine that there are some French academics who are still very concerned about English in the world. I think in Spain you've kind of relaxed about it. I don't get the same sense of it. What I say to people like that is you need to find a way, and what we say in our book actually, you need to find a way to make English your friend. That English can actually help multilingualism and more bilingualism. It doesn't have to be an obstacle to it. But what the result of that is going to be is some quite differentiated levels of language learning for different purposes and different people. Sorry, I went off the point slightly.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question. In the EU context, Do you think that current statements by ministers about foreign language teaching at primary level can in any way make up for the fact that languages become optional post-GCSE?
If you ask children if they wanted to study maths at the age of 14, half of them would say no, or maybe more than half of them would say no. So I'm not a great supporter of optionality, but that's part of the politics, the political landscape in England. Choice is the word, and the smallest possible compulsory curriculum. So, no, I didn't agree with that. What we see, on the other hand, what we do have to realise, and maybe that's the case here as well, I think it's the case in many countries, that many pupils of 14, 15 and 16 learn languages badly and don't like learning languages. And that was what was happening, and head teachers were saying that, and teachers were saying that, and they said, we don't want these children who don't want to learn. So it was more tricky than it seemed. I still didn't agree with it. I don't think that earlier start will compensate. What I think is that an earlier start could change the way that people learn languages and change their attitude so they are more positive about it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There are some more questions, but I'd like to ask you a personal question. You've been director of SILT for 11 years, I think, and then you've been the national champion for languages for 7 years. So I think you're the person in the UK, or at least in England, with most experience in language and teaching and learning. Could you tell us something about how the national languages strategy has been implemented, if it has been successful or not, and what's going to happen in the UK in the future, or in England?
Good question. Well, I can send you the article because we've done a review of that. I think that the national languages strategy, particularly after 2007, had a very good orientation because it defined for the first time the shape of language learning. It was very successful in primary and had a very good model for introducing primary languages and training the teachers. It was not there. It had not been completed, certainly in secondary, so there was still business to be done. And the current government doesn't believe in strategies, so things will have to be done in another way. What is going to happen now is that we are reviewing the curriculum again, and so there is a consultation about what should be in the curriculum and what the content of the curriculum should be. I'm very hopeful that languages will return into the curriculum. What I'm not so clear about is what the form of that curriculum will be. There will be possibilities for the kind of things we're talking about, because the idea is to free up the curriculum, and I know that both of the main education ministers are interested in bilingual schools, but I think they're interested in elite bilingual schools, as I've described them, rather than a broader CLIL approach to languages, because they want to teach grammar.
Thank you very much.